Sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's story, which is Scary Stories for Sleepovers. Boom. And yes, as you already know, because you're here at 6, we'll be running till 8-ish. We missed one story because I got talking too slow last week. So we'll see. If we don't quite get done by 8 and you want one more final story, maybe we'll finish it. Or maybe we'll finish on time. That's funny. Sorry. Finish on time. Okay. I think we're ready to do it. Here we go. Looks like a lot of you were here last week, too. Thanks for coming back. Rick, do you know that it's 6 months to Halloween? This is Halloween. This is Halloween. I don't guess I can sing that song yet. Okay, fine. So our first story is called The Shape of Fear. Yes, that's another good. That is another excellent point. May 2nd shares the distinction of being exactly halfway to Halloween and a very dear friend's birthday, whom we did not call an old crow. The Shape of Fear. Nuh-uh. Barbara stood confidently in front of the class as she gave her report. The town of Lansford looked as if it had been lifted up from somewhere in Central Europe and plopped right down in the middle of New England. The people of Lansford were very proud of their old world customs and beliefs. Most of their traditions were harmless, but there was, well, one in particular that was quite bizarre. Some folks believed in the existence of vile creatures known as were-people, evil beings who looked like humans but could change their shape at will. Barbara was not at all nervous as she talked. Her family had lived in Lansford since the town was first established nearly 2 centuries before, and she knew more than most kids her age about its history. Where people could take on many animal forms and characteristics and were known as shapeshifters, she said. They would use this ability to harm others, she read from her paper. In the guise of a raven, a were-person could spy on its neighbors and learn their secrets. As a fox or a wolf, it could dig up and destroy crops or kill livestock. As a deadly spider or rattlesnake, it could even creep into a home or tent and commit murder without leaving behind a single clue as to its human identity. Barbara paused and looked around. Everyone was caught up in every word she said. Mrs. Kominsky, her teacher, was nodding approvingly. This is an A for sure, Barbara thought, glad she had worked so hard on her report. She continued aloud. While a shapeshifter was in its beastly form, it would not age a single minute and could not be killed. Only when it was in its human form would it grow older and finally die. Most people thought that the wicked life of a were-being was a horrible curse, Barbara explained. They believed that to become one you had to be bitten by a were-person. The bite had to be deep and draw blood. Here she lowered her voice dramatically. But at one time in the history of Lansford, the countryside was plagued by 3 terrible monsters who had been the willing prey of a very powerful were-being. They terrorized their neighbors and were finally hunted down and killed. Barbara was very proud of their own ancestor, Jonathan Rourke, had presided over the trials when the trio was finally captured and brought to justice. And the justice of 200 years before had been swift indeed. In a field near the edge of town stood a huge tree, a hanging tree that had supported 3 sturdy ropes for the accused shapeshifters. The doomed villains had died without confessing the name of their leader, the one who had corrupted them all, but because the vandalism, thefts, and murders had stopped, the search soon ended. Many modern residents were afraid of the hanging tree, but Barbara was fascinated by it. She could easily see it from her bedroom. In fact, it was so close that sometimes, when the moon was just right, Barbara could see its shadow on the thin white curtains drawn across her window. Nothing else grew in the field where it stood. Her dad said that there was probably something in the roots that had ruined the soil. But some superstitious Supercilious. But some superstitious townsfolk claimed that the were-people had been buried there, but no one knew for certain. In fact, Barbara said, lowering her papers and whispering to her wide-eyed classmates, no one knows what happened to the bodies at all. Thank you, Barbara, Mrs. Kominsky said. That was an excellent report. You may take your seat. After class, Barbara and several of her friends stopped in the local bookstore to buy the newest issue of their favorite scary magazine, Tales from Beyond the Grave. It was displayed on a tall wire rack right beside the front entrance. Oh, look at this stupid cave monster, Angela complained. It couldn't frighten my baby brother. I think the were-people of Lansford are a lot scarier. And they really existed. Barbara laughed and shook her head. No, they didn't. It's just a stupid old story that grandparents used to frighten their grandkids. But, Dolores began. But what about your report in class? You said that your own ancestor helped to catch them. I said he helped to catch 3 people who were accused of being were-people and committing crimes. Barbara laughed and corrected. I never said I actually believed they really were shapeshifters. I bet old Jonathan didn't believe it either. That's why he wasn't afraid of them. Angela tilted her head to one side and asked, What do you mean? When the bad guys had been caught, Jonathan was the only one brave enough to actually do the hanging and pronounce them dead, Barbara answered with pride. All the other people were too afraid to get close. They were probably scared of getting bitten. She lunged at Dolores, pretending to bite her neck. Dolores squealed and the other girls laughed. All at once, Barbara became aware of someone standing near the group. She looked up slowly. A small, thin-faced woman with mournful eyes was glaring at her. It is very foolish to make jest of the things that you do not understand, the woman warned. Jest? Grinning, Barbara wrinkled her nose and made a funny face at her friends. Quite so, Mistress Barbara, the stranger continued. The grin faded from Barbara's lips. How do you know my name? A dark smile barely flickered across the woman's grim face. Think of me. She paused, and the smile became almost threatening. Think of me as a friend of the family, Barbara. She turned and walked quickly out of the store. Who was that weird woman, Mistress Barbara? Dolores murmured. Barbara leaned against a large storefront window and gazed in the direction the woman had taken. Except for a couple of young boys wheeling their bikes along, the sidewalk was deserted. I don't know, she answered nervously. She had an uncomfortable feeling she had not seen the last of the old woman. It's such a lovely night, Barbara's mom said as she leaned in the doorway of her daughter's room that evening. Dad and I are going to take a walk. Would you like to come along? Barbara glanced up. No, thanks. I have reading to finish. Her mom crossed to the bedroom window, pulled back the curtains, and opened it. Well, at least you can get some fresh air in here, she said, stroking Barbara's long brown hair. We'll be back in a while. As soon as she was alone, Barbara tossed the book to the floor and got up to reclose the window. She had her hand on the sill when she noticed something that made her stop. Someone was hunched over beneath the hanging tree. Leaning out slightly, Barbara could just make out the sound of a shovel biting into the barren earth. What in the world? Barbara muttered under her breath. As she spoke, a silver-rimmed cloud slipped away from across the face of the full moon. Barbara gasped. It's her! In the bright moonlight, she could clearly see the woman who had spoken to her in the bookstore. At first, it appeared that she might be digging something up, but after a moment, it was plain that the stranger was actually burying a small, dark object. Barbara watched with growing curiosity. Finally, the woman completed her task and set off hurriedly along the dirt road that led to town. Barbara pulled the eyelet drapes closed and stood at the window for only a moment before she made up her mind to see for herself what was hidden away beneath the tree. If she acted quickly, she knew she could slip out and be back before her parents returned for their walk. So throwing on a sweater, she raced to the garden shed and grabbed a small hand trowel. Within moments, she was standing under the twisted limbs of the tree. She had stood in the same place many times before, but never alone at night. The branches cast peculiar shadows on the ground all around her, and when the breeze rustled the dry leaves, the ground almost seemed to be moving as if... Barbara shuddered to think about it. I better get out of here before I start spooking myself, she said aloud. She easily found the place where the woman had been digging and started to work in the soft earth. It wasn't long before the trowel hit something hard. Working rapidly, Barbara unearthed a small carved wooden box with a plain metal pin and clasp. Hesitantly, she slipped out the pin, then stopped. She had the eerie feeling that she was being watched. Glancing from side to side, she reassured herself that she was alone. And then from somewhere in the darkness, Barbara heard a soft rustling noise. Probably just a possum. But she could barely control the trembling of her fingers as she cautiously lifted the lid of the box. Moonlight illuminated a small shiny object. A tooth. Some sort of animal tooth on a thin leather strap. It rested on a fragile scrap of paper that appeared to have been torn from a book. As she stared inside, a shadow moved across the contents of the box. Barbara turned her gaze upward, and her eyes locked with a pair of glowing yellow eyes. A scream caught in her throat. Crouching on the limb above was a large creature, part wolf, part ferret, part rat. Slowly it edged toward her, clinging to the ancient branch with its long curved claws. Clutching the box, Barbara spun around and ran. Reaching the safety of her home, she slammed the door behind her and locked it, then raced to her room. She fell across the bed, tried to catch her breath, and then chuckled to herself. This is ridiculous, she declared to the smiling teddy bear in her dresser. It was only dumb animals. She opened the box to examine the contents more closely now. Holding the sharp-pointed tooth in the palm of her hand, she took out the folded paper and spread it open on her bed. The words were handwritten in a strange language. What is this? Looks like Latin or something, Barbara whispered to herself. Slowly she pronounced each word. Then something, a feeling, forced her to look up at the drapes drawn across the open window. The light from the full moon had painted a shadowy image of the hanging tree. It danced back and forth as the delicate white fabric moved in the soft breeze. While she watched, 3 of the horrible creatures like the one she saw in the tree before stole along the lowest branch and dropped to the ground. As if she were in a trance, Barbara's eyes returned to the page. She felt compelled to continue. She had barely spoken the last word when the first creature crept soundlessly over the sill of her open window. With growing terror, Barbara curled against the pillows as a furred paw gripped the edge of the bed with razor-like claws. The beast drew itself up onto the bed, and once again Barbara stared into its yellow, glowing eyes. "It is time," the thing hissed. "It is time to fulfill your part of the bargain, Mistress Barbara. It was most cooperative of you to voluntarily retrieve the box and read the agreement. But then we counted on your being too curious for your own good." Barbara had heard the voice before, that very day in the bookstore. "This isn't happening," she stammered. "I must be dreaming. I didn't make any bargain." "But you did. You have just agreed to it by reading the very words that have set us free." 2 more of the hideous creatures slipped into the room. "It was promised by your own ancestor, Jonathan Rourke, the were-being who made us what we are." "You're lying," Barbara screamed. "He wasn't a were-person. He killed you." "No." The beast showed its fangs with a nasty snarl. "He made it appear so. We did indeed give up our human forms and vowed to live as animals to soothe the townspeople's need for vengeance. Afterward, your ancestor lived out his life free of suspicion. In return, he arranged for us to have our freedom in a new time, a time when the old beliefs would be considered no more than tales told to frighten children." Barbara shook her head in disbelief. "You see," the creature continued, "Jonathan Rourke pledged that in 10 generations his own descendant would appear and take our place. As the time drew near, I was able to appear briefly as a human to carry out the plan." "No!" Barbara gasped. "I don't want any part of this." As she watched, the 3 creatures began to change. Their limbs stretched outward. Their faces began to take on more human features. "Oh, but it's too late," the woman snarled. "The curse has already been passed to you by the bite of your own ancestor. See for yourself." She gestured toward Barbara's clenched fist. Opening her hand, the girl saw the tooth she had clutched in fear. The tooth of Jonathan Rourke had deeply pierced her palm. Her own dark red blood trickled down her wrist. Before her own eyes, Barbara watched her trembling hand shrink into dark, fur-covered paws and her nails lengthen into powerful claws. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was no longer human. Not far away, on the path leading to their home, Barbara's mother gripped her father's arm. "What was that?" she cried out. He patted her hand and said soothingly, "Oh, it was nothing, dear. Just some kind of animal." The shape of fear. Now, the power of the mind. Welcome those who have joined us. So happy to see you. Arian smiled at Robert, a grim-faced boy who shuffled toward his place in the back of the classroom. "Hi, Robert," she said kindly. Jill leaned over from across the aisle and whispered, "I don't understand why you're nice to that know-it-all creep." She watched him with obvious distaste as he slumped into his seat. Arian reached under her desk and took out her reading book. "Oh, he's not so bad. Showing off how smart he is his way of getting attention." She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't let it bother me. Besides, he doesn't have any friends. I feel kind of sorry for him." Jill was not convinced. "Well, I think he's a Class A weirdo. It runs in the family." "Oh, that's not a very nice thing to say," Arian replied sternly. Jill rolled her eyes. "Maybe it's not nice, but you know it's true." Arian had to admit that Robert was a little strange. Everyone in town knew that his great-grandfather, Jedediah Gray, had been committed to a mental institution, that he died there. Still, Arian believed that it was cruel of the kids to tease Robert about it, but he did have a knack for getting on everyone's nerves. Just as the bell rang, Mr. Cutter hustled into the room, balancing an armload of books and papers. "Good morning, class," he said, dropping the load onto his desk. He pushed his slipping glasses back into position. "How many of you know what a myth is?" Several of the kids, including Robert, raised their hands. "Okay, Mr. Cutter said. For the rest of you, myths are made up of stories about heroic people, legendary places, or supernatural creatures. Today we're going to read a story about a mythical creature called a basilisk, a beast that was half giant snake and half rooster." Laughter rippled through the class. Robert, however, didn't crack a smile. "Don't laugh," the teacher continued. "This horrible monster was said to have had a poison breath that could destroy anything it touched." He leaned forward and lowered his voice to a throaty snarl. "And one glance from its evil eyes could turn any living thing into clay." "Stone," a chilling voice in the back of the room announced with precision. Mr. Cutter looked up in irritation. "What?" Robert stared at the teacher, huffed impolitely, and repeated himself. "Stone. The gaze of the basilisk turned people to stone, not clay." Peering at the boy over the top of his glasses, Mr. Cutter grumbled. "Oh? You seem to be quite sure of your facts, Mr. Gray. Are you personally acquainted with a basilisk?" Most of the kids burst into laughter. Red-faced Robert stared hard at his hands, now clenched into tight fists in his lap. Later, during lunch, Ariane found Robert sitting alone just outside the cafe. "Are you still angry?" she asked softly, leaning against the red brick of the wall. "Mr. Cutter shouldn't have embarrassed you like that. I guess he was upset because you corrected him so rudely in class." "Well, it doesn't give him the right to make fun of me," Robert answered, "and to make everyone laugh at me," he added quietly. "No, it doesn't, Robert. But maybe if you tried a little harder to—" "Oh, no!" gurgled Joe Washington, one of their classmates. He and a couple other boys were nearby, heading into the cafeteria. "I just saw a basilisk! Ah!" To the delight of his friends, Joe held his arms at his sides, stiffened his body, and pretended to turn to stone. "You're an idiot," Robert mumbled. "We all know what you are," Joe shot back angrily. He turned to his friends, crossed his eyes, and used one finger to make a small circling gesture near the side of his head. Snickering, the group of boys moved on. Ariane cast a glance at Robert. He was trembling with anger. "You're not very funny," she called out to Joe. "I think you're—" But she stopped when a sudden movement near the top of the brick wall caught her eye and turned her attention upward. A decorative concrete eagle perched at the corner of the building was vibrating. As she watched, a crack in the base appeared and the stone bird shuddered and slowly toppled forward. "Look out!" Ariane screamed. Joe jerked back in surprise, and the statue crashed to bits on the sidewalk right in front of him. "Wow!" one of the boys murmured. "That was close." Turning quickly to Robert, Ariane was shocked to see that he was smiling. "You know what, Ariane?" Robert said slowly. Maybe you're right. It was rude of me to correct Mr. Cutter in class. Be much more effective for him to learn by experience. Perhaps he should examine the basilisk for himself. He threw his jacket over his shoulder and sauntered off, whistling tunelessly. But it's just a myth, Arian said aloud to no one. It doesn't exist. Yeah. Close, but myth, Arian. When Arian walked into class the following morning, it was plain that something was wrong. The principal, Mrs. Wareham, and Mrs. Gaudio, a substitute teacher, stood solemnly at the head of the class. When everyone was seated, Mrs. Wareham spoke. I'm afraid I have some very grim news, she said in a hushed tone. I'm deeply sorry to say that Mr. Cutter passed away last night. The students sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Gaudio has agreed to take over your class. All day, Mr. Cutter's sudden death was all everyone talked about. And then after school, when Ariane was leaving, she noticed a knot of children gathering around Carrie Lewis, the police chief's daughter. Out of curiosity, she joined them. It was just too weird, Carrie was saying. My dad told my mom they found Mr. Cutter curled up in a corner of his backyard, and he was only wearing pajamas. No robe, no slippers. Geez, Jill exclaimed. It must have been below freezing last night. Why would he go out like that? Who knows, Carrie said. Since a lot of furniture was turned over, my dad thinks it was some kind of struggle, and Mr. Cutter ran outside to get away. But that's not the strangest part. The girl lowered her voice to a whisper, and the other children leaned in closer. There was something wrong with Mr. Cutter's skin. It was all really dry and hard. And you know what else? Everyone held their breath while they were waiting for the final detail. My dad said he'd never seen a more scared expression on a dead man's face in his whole life, and he said he'd never forget it as long as he lived. As the other kids chattered excitedly, Ariane let Carrie's words sink in. There was something wrong with his skin, like dry and hard. Like stone? Ariane wondered. Suddenly, a terrible thought came to her mind. Could Robert have had anything to do with what had happened to Mr. Cutter? Across the playground, she could see Robert and Joe. They appeared to be arguing again. It looked serious. Joe grabbed Robert's jacket, and the two boys tugged at it for a moment. Finally, Robert wrenched the coat free, whirled around, and ran. Shaking her head, Ariane set off for the library to do some research reports she had to do for school. When she got there, Ariane wasn't surprised to see Robert at a table in the reading room. He was hunched over a large book as if he were entranced, and didn't notice as she walked up behind him. His jacket, with a ripped sleeve, was slung over the back of his chair. Ariane noticed that his total attention was on an illustration in the open book. She slipped closer and peered over his shoulder. It was a frightful drawing of a scaly winged dragon. Its lips were curled back over long ghastly fangs, and tongues of flame poured from its flaring nostrils. Robert's hand rested on a second book, a small, leather-bound volume on the table beside him, and he seemed to be muttering something over and over under his breath. Ariane felt a chill of fear snake up her spine. Without a word, she edged away and left the library. Did you hear what happened? Jill cornered Ariane as she arrived at class the next morning. It's just so gross. The police discovered a body a couple hours ago. It was fried to a crisp and stuffed up at the big old water tower out by the refinery. Carrie says it took them over an hour to get the body down. They still don't know who it is. Ariane focused for a moment on the empty desk where Joe Washington usually sat, and then she shifted her gaze to Robert. She watched as he calmly ran his fingers along a freshly mended tear on the sleeve of his jacket. Mrs. Gaudio began the morning lesson, but Ariane couldn't concentrate. Over and over she said to herself that it wasn't possible. She was being ridiculous. How could Robert have anything to do with these terrible events? But her thoughts kept returning to the horrible dragon she had seen him studying so carefully. After school, Ariane attended the meeting of her science club. This afternoon they were discussing science projects to enter in the youth display at the state fair, but she barely paid attention. What do you think, Ariane? She heard as if the voice were coming from a great distance. What? Jill had slipped into the seat next to her. I said, what do you think about doing a model of a volcano? Are you all right? You haven't heard a word I've been saying. Ariane stood and looked at and gathered up her books. Oh, I'm fine. There's just something I have to do. I'll see you tomorrow, Jill. With that, she briskly took off. 15 minutes later, Ariane was standing on the sidewalk in front of the 3-story town library. The old building appeared ominous in the fading light of an early midwinter evening. Still trying to make up her mind, she surveyed the intricate designs on the massive front door. The library had been built in the early 30s, and it was adorned with an array of gaudy decorations and carvings that were popular at the time, much like on the top of the building where, well, that's a different story, isn't it? At the side of the building, a sweeping outdoor stair led to a third-floor patio where evil-looking gargoyles guarded each corner of the building. See, it is like Dana's building. Setting her jaw firmly, she strode up the steps. As she had expected, she found Robert at a table in the otherwise deserted reading room. The same mythology volume and the small leather-bound book were in front of him. "Why?" she said firmly, more as a demand than as a question. Without the slightest trace of surprise, Robert looked into her eyes. He knew exactly what she meant. "They deserved it," he responded bitterly. Ariane felt her jaw drop. She had hoped that she was wrong about Robert, but now she knew her suspicions were true. A jumble of thoughts and fears reeled through her mind, but all she could say was, "How?" "Hate is a very powerful thing," Robert said simply. "My great-grandfather knew that. He realized that if it could be channeled properly, it could be used as a weapon. It's all here in his diary." The boy tapped the cover of the small book. "He didn't have the powers of concentration to make it work. But I do," he snapped with sudden fury, "and whatever I imagine becomes real for as long as I can concentrate." He spoke with such force that Ariane flinched. "You've got to stop this, Robert," she pleaded, but he only laughed. "If you don't, then I'll find a way to stop you." "What can you do?" he grinned, stepping closer. Ariane began to back away. I'll go to the police." "Don't be stupid, Ariane. They won't believe you." He softened his voice and reached out his hand. "Ariane, you are the only person who's ever been nice to me. I don't want to have to hurt you." Twisting away, Ariane marched to the library doors and down the front steps. Outside it was already quite dark, and the shops and businesses were closed for the night. The empty sidewalk was dotted with pools of light from the glowing street lamps. She paused for a moment, then turned in the direction of the police station. High above, at the corner of the library rooftop, a grotesque stone gargoyle trembled slightly. Its eyes sparked to life, glowing like embers, and then it stretched its enormous bat-like wings and leaped into the air. Ariane walked faster. She became aware of a soft whirring noise above. At her feet, she saw dried, dead leaves skitter along the sidewalk as if pushed by a breeze. The air began to press in on her, and a voice deep inside screamed a warning. Without looking up, she began to run. Only a few yards overhead, a gargoyle let out a piercing screech and spread its glistening talons for the attack. Ariane felt something smash into her from behind, and she went sprawling on the ground. She twisted her head just in time to see the creature beating its inky black leathery wings against the cold night air, just like Talus, only those are purple. As it turned, she saw the horrible red gash of a mouth opening to expose its stabbing fangs. "No, no, stay away from me!" she screamed. Springing to her feet, she dashed away towards the town square and dove under the cover of a small white gazebo meant for picnickers. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she huddled in the tiny structure, but it was no use. The demonic creature plummeted with full force on the fragile roof, and splinters of wood shot in every direction. Crying hysterically, Ariane covered her ears, but she could not block out the beast's hideous cries. She bolted from under the crumbling gazebo and scrambled into a hiding place under a holly hedge. The sharp spines of the leaves tore at her face and her hands as she crawled, but it was worth it. The enraged creature continued to claw at the ruined gazebo and hadn't noticed her escape. Quickly creeping out from under the holly hedge and keeping to the shadows of the buildings, she made her way back to the Shawnee Library. "Let me in! Let me in!" she wailed, tugging on the brass handles and banging on the huge wooden doors. But they were locked. From somewhere in the darkness, she heard the cry of a gargoyle getting closer. Frantically, she looked around. The outside stairway down to the beach. If she could make it to the third level, she could smash one of the library's windows that faced the patio and crawl inside. Where was everybody? Probably over in the Kilora Glen, I would expect. Sobbing, Ariane launched first up one flight, then another, and when she reached the third floor, her heart sank. Heavy wooden shutters were securely locked over each of the windows. "I warned you. I did. I warned you." Ariane whirled around to see Robert standing near the edge of the patio. "I really am sorry." Then he cupped one hand to his mouth. "She's here, my pet," he called out into the night. With a blood-curdling howl, the savage gargoyle swooped down. At the last second, Ariane pressed her trembling body against the wall, avoiding the attack. Robert was not as lucky. The edge of the beast's wing hit Robert in the shoulder. Crying out, he toppled over the low safety rail and plunged to the ground below with a grisly thud. All at once the night was so still that Ariane could hear the pounding of her own heart. The head librarian clucked to her young assistant the following morning. Ho, 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 such a tragedy. But I told everyone we need to put a gate in that stairway and lock it up at night. The poor boy must have slipped. We should hear the story the little girl's telling, gargoyles and dragons. Kids probably think she'll get in trouble if she tells the truth. As she spoke, the woman looked around the reading room, and her voice took a harsher tone. Look at this mess, Andrea. Why haven't you shelved these books yet? If this job is too difficult for you to handle, I can always find someone else, you know. I'll take care of it right away. Mrs. Jordan, her assistant mumbled, trying to hide her anger. The older woman always seemed to find fault with everything. Picking up a mythology book from the reading room table, Andrea read the number on the spine and slid it into its proper place. Well, see that you do, Mrs. Jordan ordered and walked away. Next, Andrea picked up a small, leather-bound volume from the table. Someday I'll find a way to teach that old battle axe a lesson, Andrea murmured. Absent-mindedly, Andrea flipped open the little book and began to read. The Power of the Mind, with a guest appearance from the Gargoyles' high-top Data Barrett's building. Ooh, The Rising Terror. This is a fun one. Gives new meaning to the damned. Hello, J. Bank. You joined us. Good to see you. Holken, welcome. Endure. If I said that right, welcome. The Rising Terror. Lightning flickered over the valley, silhouetting the dark mountains that loomed all around, making me feel as if I were at the bottom of some deep, dark pit. So much rain filled the air that moving around seemed like swimming. Despite my slicker, I was wet to the skin and constantly feeling the cold trickle of the rain. But I ignored it, as did the other scouts and volunteers struggling in the dark to save our town from the rain-swollen river. Hey, give me a hand here, Steve, Mr. Baxter said. A half-dozen cars and trucks were parked facing the sandbagged riverbank, but even with the help of their headlights, I could barely see through the rain and darkness. I made my way to help him heft a filled sandbag. Together we hauled it to the dike, almost 4 feet high now, and heaved it on top. On the other side, the muddy river water turned with the fury of a caged animal. I had a horrible feeling that it would soon break free with terrible revenge. The ferocious rainstorm had gone on for almost 2 days now and showed no sign of stopping. Things hadn't gotten really bad until this morning. With school council, my friend and I were free to help with sandbagging. After a whole day of shoveling sand into bags and throwing them onto the dike, my arms and back were numb with fatigue. My hands were so tired I could barely make a fist. But this was our town, and so we kept going. My house, the one where I'd lived all my life with my mom and my sister, was only 2 blocks from the river. The water as high as it was now, without the dike, we would have been flooded for sure. Even so, the dam upriver if it were to give way, the wall of water rushing through the valley would be so mighty it would destroy our house completely, but there wasn't much I could do, was there? So I filled sandbags as long as they let me. Our efforts had pretty much destroyed Riverside Park, turning it into a muddy wreck. Behind us across River Road, which was our town's main street, the storefronts were all dark. The only light came from Bert's Riverside Cafe, which had been turned into our flood-fighting headquarters. Bert had been in there cooking and making coffee all day. It's where my friends and I had eaten when we went to dry off and rest every couple hours. As I was looking over the cozy warm glow from Bert's and yearning for another cup of hot chocolate, when I saw a group of men running towards us from the cafe. I recognized Mayor Whiting by the white cowboy hat that he was always wearing, and I got a bad feeling in my stomach. We worked too long and too hard for it all to end now. The men split up and went to different groups of sandbaggers along the river. I stopped shoveling sand so I could listen as Mr. Whiting ran up and talked to Mr. Baxter. It's time to leave, Mike, he shouted over the rush of the raining river. They've got the gates full open up in the dam, and the river's just topped it. They don't know if it's going to hold. Everybody's got to get out of this valley now. Mr. Baxter didn't seem surprised, just disappointed like the rest of us. After the mayor moved on, Mr. Baxter took off his hat and stared out of the river for a minute, mindless of the rain. His house was just down the street from mine, and his business, a lumber yard a little way up the valley, was threatened too. If the dam went, he'd lose it all. But after a moment, he slapped his hat back on, took a deep breath, and called for attention. Right, listen, boys. We've done all we can here. It's time to leave the valley and meet up with our families up in Johnsville. Nobody moved at first. We just stood there with our shovels and sandbags. We all knew what leaving meant. Within an hour, the river would catch up with our sandbagging efforts. First, the water would start to trickle over the top, then it would flow steadily over. Soon the wall of sandbags would weaken and collapse, allowing the water to wash through the streets of our town. All our hard work would have been for nothing. But if the dam gave way, the water would sweep over the sandbags and wipe out our homes. Whether we were here or not, Mr. Baxter knew that too. Move, he commanded. Bring your tools, Greg, Paul, Bob, Pat, Steve. You come with me. The rest of you boys go with Mr. Frederick. Hustle! Carrying my shovel, I joined the other boys, following Mr. Baxter where his Jeep Grand Cherokee is parked. We tossed our tools in back and then climbed in the front seats. Water ran off our slickers, soaking the seats, but Mr. Baxter didn't seem to mind. When we were all in, he said, I'm going to check one and make sure Mr. Frederick and all the others are all set, right? You guys sit tight. I'll be right back. He climbed out again and shut the door. Oh, man, it feels good to be out of that rain, Paul said, pulling off his hat. Under it, his red hair was drenched and matted. Greg pulled off his glasses and tried to wipe them clean. I feel like I'm never going to be dry again. My whole body's turning into a big prune. Oh, no, Bob said, rifling through all of his pockets. What's the matter? I asked wearily. He was always causing trouble of some sort, always trying to get attention. I lost my pocket knife, Bob said, giving up a search for his pockets. I was using it to cut twine to tie the sandbag closed. I must have left on the box of twine back there. He started groping for the door handle. What are you doing? demanded Pat, who was sitting right next to him. I'm going back for my knife. I know exactly where it is. Pat grabbed his arm. Mr. Baxter said to wait here in the car. We can't leave till he gets back anyway. It'll just take me a minute. He threw the door open and slid out, his slicker pulling it away from Pat's grasp. Idiot, Pat muttered. We ought to leave him. I watched Bob's slicker, a yellow blur, disappear into the dark rain, too tired to comment. The rest of us sat there in exhausted silence. After a few minutes, the driver's door opened. Mr. Baxter climbed in and glanced back at us. Everyone ready? But before we could answer, his face grew hard with concern. Wait, who's missing? Bob, Pat said. He went back to his pocket knife. We tried to stop him. He should have been back by now, Paul said. He left pretty much right after you did. Mr. Baxter heaved an exasperated sigh and checked his watch. Then he opened his door again. No one is to leave this truck. Got it? We all agreed. He slammed the door pretty hard, and then he too disappeared in the direction of the river. Across the river road, the lights had gone out in Bert's Riverside Cafe. The headlights that had been illuminating the dike for us were threading their way out of the park and flowing up the street in the direction of the bridge that would take us across the river and out of the valley to safety. After a few minutes, our headlights were the only ones left. We waited in silence, exhausted. The rain continued to drum on the roof of the Jeep so relentlessly that it seemed as if it were trying to penetrate the metal roof to get at us. I shivered a little and wished for dry clothes. The constant throbbing of the rain lulled us so that when the side door suddenly opened, we all jerked around to look. Bob clambered back up onto the seat and managed to spray cold rainwater everywhere. The door closed behind him. A moment later, Mr. Baxter climbed into the driver's seat. Now, are we all ready? In seconds, the big Jeep was jouncing through the darkness between the trunks of huge oak trees. Did you get your stupid knife? Pat asked, Bob jabbing him in the ribs with his elbow. Bob elbowed him back. No, it must have fallen off the box. Water was already coming over the sandbags and covering the ground a few inches deep. I had to really feel around for it. If I had a couple more minutes, I could have found it. He glared at the back of Mr. Baxter's head. The rest of us were grimly silent. Water was already coming over the sandbags, Bob had said. That was it. The town would be flooded in the next half hour. Probably sooner. We had almost reached River Road and cleared the park when the Jeep lurched and got hung up. Its engine roared, its tires spun helplessly in the mud. Suddenly the town's fate dwindled in importance as it struck me that we might still be stuck here when the dike broke. But Mr. Baxter backed up a few feet and, with a running start, bowled through the last few yards of mud, over the curb and onto River Road. The ride got smoother as we gained speed and splashed our way down in the dark street. I relaxed back in my seat, watching our darkened town go past my window, probably for the last time. The baseball field was already underwater. The parking lot at the school was a lake. "Oh, look at that," Bob said, peering out his window. Everyone leaned in and craned to see, but I was on the wrong side of the Jeep. "What is it?" I asked. "The cemetery," Mr. Baxter answered grimly. "Looks like there was a mudslide." The cemetery, I knew, stretched up the slope of the valley wall. As my imagination started to conjure images of what it would look like after a mudslide, I was glad I had missed seeing it. Shortly after that, we'd reached the bridge that stretched out over the river and connected our town with the interstate several miles farther along the road, but we had to pass through a couple of feet of water to get to the foot of the bridge. As the Jeep's headlights speared down its length, we could see cars stopped on the far side. Men were standing there frantically waving their arms. I thought one of them was waving a white cowboy hat, but I couldn't be sure. "What's going on?" "I don't know," Mr. Baxter said. "Wait here." He started to get out of the Jeep, but he stopped as a horrible screeching sound pierced the noise of the rain. As we all watched in amazement, the far end of the bridge swung away from the cars on the opposite shore. The shrieks of its tortured steel continued to penetrate the night like nails on a chalkboard. Then the bridge snapped free on our end, tumbled away in the raging black waters, and disappeared. We suddenly found ourselves staring across hundreds of yards of open water where the bridge had once been. Mr. Baxter resettled himself in the driver's seat. He took a deep breath and blew it out. "Well, boys, it looks like we're moving on to Plan B." "What's Plan B?" Bob asked. "I'll let you know when I figure it out." He got on his cellular phone and contacted the mayor, talking in a low whisper while the rest of us continued to stare in shock where the bridge used to be. We all knew what the loss of the bridge meant. The river was already over the ridge in Stockton, and the next bridge was another 30 miles away. We were trapped here. "Okay," Mr. Baxter announced when he got off the cellular phone. "This is what we're going to do. Mr. Craig, as you know, the mayor, you may know, is our town funeral director. Was the only person in town who did not evacuate his home earlier this afternoon. Since this house is highest up the valley wall of any house in town, his decision might not have been as ill-advised as it sounds, though. So we all are going to visit Mr. Craig and take advantage of his hospitality." "Ha! What hospitality?" Pat grumbled. "Mr. Craig's the meanest man in town." Yeah, he may be a sour old hermit," Mr. Baxter said cheerfully as he turned the Jeep around. "But even he'll have to show a little consideration under these circumstances." "Yeah, maybe if we pay him," Bob said. "My dad said he's so cheap that he charges people for fancy, expensive coffins, and then he buries them in plain old pine boxes so he can keep most of the money for himself." Enough of that, Mr. Baxter said. "You know better than to listen to rumors. And since Mr. Craig's going to be our host, you shouldn't speak ill of the man." "Maya Savage, welcome, hello." As we headed back, Mr. Baxter switched on the radio. Maybe he wanted to hear the latest of the dam, or maybe he thought music would calm us. Either way, we were all quiet, thinking about staying with Mr. Craig. When we passed the cemetery again, this time I was on the right side of the Jeep for a good look. Most of the slope had been wiped clean by the mudslide, and at the bottom was a dark mess of oozing mud, headstones, and exposed coffins. I couldn't see really well in the darkness, but the coffins I saw seemed pale. If there were any with glossy dark finish of maple or mahogany, I couldn't see them. When we reached town, we took side streets that led us higher up the valley wall until we reached a point where we were on the same level as the roofs of our houses down closer to the river. Mr. Baxter slowed the Jeep as we approached a short drive to Mr. Craig's old house with its steep gabled windows and the rounded tower on one corner. Lights showed through the curtains on the first floor. Mr. Baxter pulled up as close to the house as he could get, and then we all piled out. He led us at a run up the stairs to the front porch. After being out of the rain for a little while, it seemed worse to go back into it even for a few seconds. But soon we would be indoors, and we'd have a chance to dry off properly. Mr. Baxter had to knock on the door 4 or 5 times before Mr. Craig answered it. Tall and lanky, he didn't open the screen door, watching us as if we were insects he was afraid might try to get into his house. His graying hair was slicked back from his face, which was drawn into wrinkles around his eyes and mouth. He wore the same black suit and shiny black shoes he always wore. except the jacket was missing, revealing suspenders over his bony shoulders. Mr. Baxter greeted him and explained where we had been sandbagging and had come trapped in the valley when the bridge washed away. He finished by saying, "The boys and I'd be most obliged if you'd let us weather out the night here with you." Mr. Craig squinted at Mr. Baxter as if he did not understand. Then he shook his head. No, he said, and started to close the door. "Wait," Mr. Baxter protested. "You don't understand. We have nowhere else to go, Mr. Craig. If the dam goes, this will be the safest place in the valley." Yes. According to the radio," Mr. Craig explained impatiently, "the dam has already gone. The water should be here in 5 or 10 minutes, and you should have thought of that before getting yourselves trapped." Again he started to close the door. Mr. Baxter grabbed at the screen door. "Look, you miserable old man, whether you want us here or not." Mr. Craig produced a shotgun from behind the door and leveled at Mr. Baxter. "I repeat, you are unwelcome here. Leave my property immediately, or I shall be forced to defend it." Mr. Baxter looked at Mr. Craig as if he were crazy, as clearly he was. But then he backed away from the door, ushering us behind him. "Back to the Jeep, boys," he said as he moved away. After Mr. Craig closed his front door, we all breathed easier. "Heartless old lunatic," Mr. Baxter was muttering under his breath. But once we all got back in the Jeep, his usual good humor returned. As he backed the Jeep out of the driveway, Bob asked, "Where are we going now, Mr. Baxter?" "Not far, Bob." He pulled the Jeep back out onto the street and parked at the curb. "There, we're off Mr. Craig's property, and we're still at the highest point in the valley." "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Pat asked. "About the dam going?" "Oh, I don't know," Mr. Baxter answered, turning up the radio. "We'll soon find out." As it turned out, Mr. Craig had been right. The weight of the rain-swollen river had been too much. The dam had crumbled. All that water was now rushing through the valley, scouring it clean of trees, houses, everything. We didn't have to wait long for it. Looking out across the dark roofs of the town, we saw some come crashing into view, a wall of churning dark water as high as a house and as wide as a valley. The whole trees bobbed it like clothespins in a washing machine. The Jeep shook and a terrible rumbling filled the air as the angry river slammed through town. In an instant, the houses below us disappeared under the roiling water. Telephone poles toppled, cars flipped and tumbled, the roofs of the houses peeled away. After the initial wall of water had passed through, the river continued to rage. The water came up to the floor of the Jeep, but no higher. We felt the power of the water as it sluiced through the streets of our town and carried it all away. No one spoke. We watched the dark water and the parade of debris it carried from upriver. Mobile homes, billboards, a vending machine, furniture. Nearby, I saw an oblong wooden box catching the upper branches of a tree that used to be 20 feet off the ground but were now at water level. "Is that what I think it is?" Greg asked, pointing. Before anyone could answer, the box seemed to shift and turn over. My mouth was dry as I whispered, "Did something just fall out of it?" We all stared at the coffin, waiting for something to happen. But as the seconds passed, it seemed as if it might have been only our imaginations in the rain. And then Bob screamed. The figure rose slowly from the water in a shuffling walk, as if it were just walking up the road and hadn't noticed all the water. It wore a dark suit. Its face was inhumanly sunken. Before we could recover from the sight of this figure, another rose slowly from the water. This one wore a tattered dress. Its mouth hung open. The two figures trudged up the driveway towards Mr. Craig's house. Before they had taken 3 steps, another figure appeared, and then another. By the time the first two had reached Mr. Craig's front door, dozens of others had risen from the dark water to join them, all in formal clothing that was badly tattered and deteriorated. "They're all dead people," Bob breathed. "Yeah, the people he cheated," I said. "Buried in plain old pine boxes." It's a sure thing Mr. Craig didn't open the door for them, if he saw them coming. But after 6 or 7 of them had reached the porch, we saw the front door smashed open anyway. Then they started to flood inside. "We should do something," Pat said. "Shouldn't we?" Mr. Baxter shook his head slowly, staring at the house. This he brought on himself. Half the dead people had entered the house when we heard the blast of the shotgun. It was repeated once. but no more. After half a minute, the dead people who were still outside stopped and waited while the others came back out. Then they all walked back toward the water and us. "What are they carrying?" Bob asked, straining to see. I whispered my answer. "Mr. Craig." 6 of them had him, carrying him high like pallbearers. He thrashed and struggled, but he could not seem to break free. When they reached the water, they did not pause or falter. They just kept walking until the water covered them as it had the rest of our town. We all watched the spot where Mr. Craig had disappeared for long seconds and then minutes, longer than a human being could possibly survive. Finally, Mr. Baxter started the Jeep's engine and drove us up Mr. Craig's driveway completely out of the water. After turning off the engine, he said quietly, "Boys, I'll put this to a vote. We can either spend the night here in the Jeep, cold and wet and uncomfortable, or we can go inside the house, dry off, warm up, and find some bedding. Who votes to stay here?" It was unanimous. Even Mr. Baxter raised his hand. We spent the night in the Jeep. I don't believe any of us, despite our exhaustion, did much sleeping. The National Guard came in motorboats and rescued us the next morning. The rain had stopped and the water had already gone down quite a bit, but our homes were gone. The process of rebuilding took years, but working together just as we had that night sandbagging the river, we made our town as good as it had ever been before. Everyone helped. Well, everybody except Mr. Craig. His was the only house that was not destroyed, but he was never seen or heard of again after that dark night when the river took our town. Rising terror. You know, that's a good point, J-Bag. They don't get a full refund. But then again, I think they did. All right. So, it's the top of the hour. For those who just joined us, we have another hour of stories. Yay! See, when I got 2 hours to go, I can land right on time. But no, any other hour, oh well. So, I'm happy you're here with us. I hope that the walking trees aren't driving you crazy. Okay, I gotta stop and look. Who is the giant gorilla? I assume it's probably J-Mac. It is J-Mac. I like that gorilla. So this next story should have a special meaning, especially for those of you here in at the Halloween town swamp here in Kitely. This story is called Spider Bites. Yeah, Maya, there was a lot more wolves and a lot more gators last time, and now there's one wolf, I think one, maybe 2 gators, and lots of spiders. I don't know why. Oh, well. Something was wrong with Kativa's leg. She felt it even before she opened her eyes that morning. A dry burning sensation at the bottom of her right ankle, just below her calf. Her fingertips found a raised area, its diameter the size of a nickel. The middle of the huge bump stung as if it had been shot with a needle. Frowning, Kativa kicked the sheets off and sat up in bed. A wedge of morning sun spotlighted a large red welt on her leg. She stared at it for a few seconds, her heart pounding tightly in her chest, and then she flung herself out of bed and hurried into the hall. In the next room, Kativa's 6-year-old sister saw her rushing by. "What's the matter, Tiva?" she called out. Blinking her eyes sleepily, Natasha's dark hair stuck straight up from the pillow, making her look like an exotic bird. "Something bit me last night," Kativa cried as she raced down the hall toward her parents' rooms. "Mom, Dad, look at my leg." Kativa's father rolled over, yawning. Her mother sat up in bed and stretched. "Calm down, honey. Come on, show me. Kativa pulled up her pajama leg, revealing the red welt. "Oh, my," her mom gasped, and then her father sat up and squinted at Kativa's calf. "I'll bet anything that's a spider bite." "Ugh, a spider?" Kativa cried, imagining the 8-legged creature still crawling around her room. "I'll take care of it, honey," her dad said, his head falling back down on the pillow. "Just as soon as I wake up, all right?" But it wasn't that easy. Right after breakfast, the entire family headed to Kativa's room. Kativa helped her mom change the sheets, and then the two vacuumed the room. Her dad took up the carpet around the baseboards to see if there were any nests there. Then he brought a ladder into the room to check the molding near the ceiling for webs. Even Natasha did what she could, wriggling under the bed with a flashlight and timidly checking beneath the desk, but no one found anything. Well, thanks anyway, Kativa told her parents and sister. Well, in a way, it's good we didn't find it, her mom said. That means whatever bit you is certainly not in this room now. With that, her parents went out to clean up the breakfast dishes. Kativa hung around her room for a while, pulling books off the shelf to look behind them. And then she put the pajamas she'd worn into the laundry bin. She wondered if something could have burrowed into her mattress or if the tiny culprit had crawled into an electrical outlet. As Kativa rechecked every corner of her room, her sister, Natasha, sat on the edge of the bed, swinging her legs back and forth. Natasha liked to hang around her big sister and was always hoping that Kativa would have some time to play with her. Tiva, have you ever been bit by a spider before? Natasha asked casually. Kativa frowned, trying to remember. I don't think so. Why, have you? Natasha stopped swinging her legs. Her eyes grew big and round as she considered the question. Yeah. It was on our vacation last summer, remember? It happened in the hotel we stayed in. Kativa remembered seeing some tiny red marks on the back of her sister's hand. But I thought Mom and Dad said they were mosquito bites, Kativa said with a frown. Natasha shook her head firmly. No, I know it was a spider. Of course, my bites weren't as big as yours. I guess that's why Mom and Dad thought they were mosquito bites. Kativa had a definite feeling her sister was making up this story to help her feel better. She decided to play along. What was it like, Tosh? Kativa asked. Well, I was scared at first, like you, Natasha said breathlessly. But later I decided it wasn't that bad being bitten by a spider. Thank you, Natasha, Kativa said with a smile. I'll have to remember that. That night, Kativa wore clean pajamas and tucked herself in between clean sheets. She had even changed her blanket and bedspread. The room had been searched by 4 people, and she had finally convinced herself it was completely spider-free now. But when she turned out the light, she began to picture something coming for her in the darkness. When she rolled over, a strand of her own hair brushed against her cheek. She swatted at it, thinking something was scrambling over her skin. Every time the forced air heater kicked on, bringing a loud blowing noise in the room, Kativa jumped. Soon she was sure that from the dark ceiling above, some unseen thing was lowering itself onto her from a slender thread. Finally, Kativa turned on her light, climbed out of bed, and rummaged through her desk until she found the old seashell nightlight she had used when she was Natasha's age. She plugged it into the outlet near the bed and smiled as the familiar pink-orange glow filled every dark corner of the room. The next morning, another big red welt appeared, this time on her left calf just below the knee. Kativa shrieked in disbelief, then ran into her parents' room. The spider got me again, she screamed, pointing at her leg. It's like it's hunting me or something. Her parents came over, shaking their heads. Her mom washed the bite with alcohol, as she had done the morning before, and her dad knelt on one knee next to her, still knotting his tie. I'm really sorry, honey, he said, his face grim as he studied the bite. I'll call an exterminator to spray the entire house, inside and out. I promise you there won't be an insect or a spider anywhere on our entire property. Kativa's eyes filled with tears. I don't think I can stand to sleep in my room tonight. I'll make up a bed in the guest room for you tonight, her mom offered. Kativa nodded, looking down at the matching bright red spider bites, one on each leg. When Kativa got home from school, the whole house smelled like bug spray. She and her mom went around opening all the windows and setting up fans to blow some fresh air into the place. Kativa started to feel a little better after she spotted the bodies of tiny house spiders and moths lying on the floor, and she realized the exterminator's poison had done its job. Still, she refused to go anywhere near her own room. Just before bedtime, Kativa finally asked Natasha to go in there to get her pajamas. She was sitting at the desk in the guest bedroom, making a half-hearted attempt to do some homework when Natasha came in. Here you go, Tiva, she said, setting down Kativa's pajamas, then lying down in the bed. What you doing? Oh, I'm working on my endangered species report, Kativa said, thumbing through the papers before her. Normally, Kativa hated it when her sister bugged her while she was studying, but Natasha had been feeling sick all afternoon, and Kativa felt sorry for her. You won't believe how much homework you're going to get, Natasha, when you're my... She broke off her words, startled by her little sister's zombie-like stare. Natasha wasn't listening. Instead, the little girl was staring down at the welts on Kativa's legs. I know how you feel, you know, Natasha whispered dramatically. The spider in that hotel bit me more than once, too. What? Kativa said in a weak voice. Yeah. Yeah, it did, Natasha answered, her voice growing excited. The truth of the matter was that the whole topic was starting to make Kativa feel very uncomfortable. She decided to change the subject. Natasha, would you mind doing one more favor for me? Kativa asked. The girl brightened. Sure, Tiva, anything. Could you go into my room again and bring me my seashell nightlight? Natasha, thrilled to have another mission, marched immediately down the hall. It was weird, sleeping in the guest room. Everything looked different. The Indian art prints on the wall, lit by the soft reddish glow of the nightlight, made it seem as if she were in some kind of museum. Even the noises of the house, like the distant hum of the refrigerator and the furnace, sounded different from this room. She knew there couldn't possibly be any spiders in here. There couldn't be any in her own room either, or anywhere else in the whole house, thanks to the exterminator. Still, it took a long time for Kativa to fall asleep. In the morning, the bite was on her arm this time, on her left wrist, right where she would have worn a watch if she'd had one. Kativa didn't even scream when she woke and saw it. She just felt weak. She lay in bed under the paintings of corn and handlooms and foxes and stared at her wrist as if she were trying to tell the time. It's impossible. This is impossible, she thought in confusion. How did it find me in here? When her parents came in a few minutes later to wake her up for school, Kativa held up her arm without a word, tears glistening in her eyes. For a moment, both grown-ups simply stared at the new red bump with their mouths open. I don't believe it, her dad fumed. That exterminator's coming right back here. Let me try something first, her mom said, still examining Kativa's arm. There's a man at the college who studies bugs. I think his name is Professor Weber. Weber. I've heard he knows everything about bugs, so maybe he can give us some advice. Kativa's dad bent over their arm, shaking his head. That's worth a try. Don't worry, Kativa. We'll find that spider. Professor Weber's office, located in the biology building in the State College campus, was filled with bugs. Hundreds of butterflies, each pinned to a small mounting board hung from the walls. The bookshelves were covered with volumes on insects, and in one corner of the room was a huge glass-covered table housing the biggest assortment of spiders Kativa had ever seen. Everything from huge hairy tarantulas to glossy black widows was under that glass, mounted and labeled. Quite a collection, don't you think? Said a tall man behind the desk. He stood up lanky limbs, extending a long arm to Kativa's mother, his dark glassy eyes shutting. I'm Professor Weber. He grinned at Kativa. I understand you have a bug bite you want me to see. Kativa nodded and pushed up her sleeve. This is the third bite I've had. It happened just last... Oh, May. That is a big one. He walked around his desk and over to Kativa and her mother with only 2 steps of his long, thin legs. Then he groped in his pockets and drew out a magnifying glass. Oh, in fact, this is the biggest one I've ever seen. Is it a spider bite? Kativa asked in a quavering voice. Oh, yes, definitely a spider. You can get some idea of the size of the spider that bit you by looking at the wound. See there are 2 separate punctures. Those are the fang marks. Kativa stared down in horror at the arm. Now the professor had mentioned it, she could make out 2 individual white spots almost an inch apart. She cast a glance at the nearly spider-filled table, her toes curling in her shoes. The spider that had made the marks on her arm was probably much bigger than any of the spiders in this room. Well, what can we do about this, Professor Weber? Kativa's mother asked. Her face was creased with worry. Hello, Kayaker. This thing keeps biting my daughter every night. The tall man shrugged. Some spiders actually show stalking behavior within their territories. A little grin never quite left his face, as if he were amused by Kativa's situation. He turned toward her. It appears this spider has grown quite fond of you. Why don't you try moving to a different room? I did, Kativa cried out in frustration. It got me there, too. Oh, my. Oh, well, that means your spider must have a quite large territory indeed. He fell silent and continued to look in fascination at Kativa's arm. Her mother sighed impatiently. Well, Dr. Weber, do you have any advice for us? Professor Weber sat down once more and put his elbows on the desk, placing the tips of his long fingers together. Well, there is an old legend that comes to mind. It says that if a particular spider bites you 4 times, Well, but you will turn into a spider yourself. Didn't you say you've been bitten 3 times now, young lady? That means maybe the next time. Kativa's mother suddenly rose to her feet. Oh, what nonsense. My daughter's upset enough about these bites, Professor Weber. What business do you have trying to frighten her with silly stories like that? Yes, yes. Sorry, I don't believe that old myth either. He said, a tight little smile on his face. I was only trying to lighten you two up a little. Kativa's mom rolled her eyes at her daughter. Well, could you at least tell us what kind of spider this is, Professor Weber, so we know if it's dangerous? His face assumed a look of curiosity. I'll tell you the truth. I have absolutely no idea, but I'd like to find out. His hands went together under his chin, making him look like a praying mantis. There's still a lot of secrets mankind has not found out about the spider world, you know. Kativa's mom guided her toward the door. Thank you, Professor Weber. We'll figure out something. Say, if you catch the big pest, I'd really appreciate it if you'd bring me by. The man called after him. I'd love to do research on it. Kativa turned around to cast one more glance at the insect-like professor. She was never happier to see a door slam on anyone in her life. At home, Kativa fell under her parents' bed. Exhausted, her mom felt her head. I think you have a fever, honey, she said. Probably a reaction to the spider bites. It would probably do you good to try to take an afternoon nap, you know. But, Mom, Kativa said, looking around the room fearfully, I'll just get bitten again. Don't worry, her mother soothed. Remember, this is my room, and neither your father nor I have a single bite on us. Sighing, Kativa made herself lie back. Her mom left the room, and in only a few minutes, Kativa fell soundly asleep. But her dreams were terrible. She kept imagining the whole house was a giant web in which she was stuck, helplessly waiting to be eaten. And from somewhere, hiding from sight within the sticky web-covered walls, there's a scrambling sound of something huge and hungry coming after her. Something on long pointed legs, with fangs like poisoned darts. When she opened her eyes after sleeping for almost 3 hours, Natasha was standing by her bedside. Hi, Tiva. Now that you're awake, would you like to play with me? Kativa stretched and shook her head. Natasha, I don't feel like playing right now. Natasha sighed. You never have any time to play, she said in a pouty voice. Sorry, Kativa said, carefully checking her arm and legs. There were no new bites. I've just got my mind on other things right now, Tasha. Natasha brightened. Mom says you talked to a crazy man at the college. Kativa smiled and sat up in bed. Yes, I guess you could say that. He told us weird stories about how if you get bitten 4 times by this one spider, you could turn into a spider yourself. Sounds nut, doesn't it? Just nutty. But Natasha did not laugh. Instead, her face filled with concern. Would you be scared if that was happening to you? Natasha asked. Kativa hadn't expected her sister to take her comments seriously. That's not happening to me, Natasha. Kativa tried to chuckle, just to show how ridiculous the idea was. But somehow she couldn't work up a laugh. She looked between the blinds out the windows. The sun was going down. The sight made her feel even colder inside. Maybe that college man meant that it's a kind of like a werewolf. Natasha pressed out her eyes wide. Except with spiders instead of wolves. You know? Wouldn't that be neat? You know? Kativa finally found her voice. Natasha, maybe we should stop talking about spiders, okay? Natasha looked at her sheepishly. Sorry, Tiva, she said with a little shrug. Then she raced off. Oh, by the way, Mom wants you to come down for dinner if you feel up to it. But Kativa wasn't hungry. All she could do was lie there, imagining that whatever and wherever she went in that house, spiders skulked behind potted plants and nestled in the valances on the tops of the curtains, ready to pounce on her. That night, her parents fixed up a cot for her in their own bedroom. They even plugged in her seashell nightlight. Her dad waved bravely at her just before rolling over to sleep. Nothing'll dare to get you tonight. Not with your father on duty, honey. Good night, dear, her mom said. Just try to get some sleep, and I'm sure you'll feel much better in the morning, all right? Kativa sighed and rested her head with her pillow, but she was unable to sleep. She wished she hadn't taken such a long nap. She lay there, her eyes wide open in the darkness. After a while, she heard her parents lapse into even breathing, followed by light snoring. Kativa finally closed her eyes. She was roused from sleep some time later. A spider, the spider, was biting her, this time on the neck. Paralyzed with fear, Kativa forced her eyes open. All she could see was Natasha's face looming before her. But something was terribly wrong. Fine black hair covered the little girl's features, and her eyes looked like furry black saucers. "It takes about a month, Tiva, and then you'll be like me," Natasha whispered, her voice like the high, screechy sound of violins being tuned. "Then we'll have plenty of time to play. Just think, Tiva, we'll be two spiders crawling through the house together after it gets dark." Kativa could not bring herself to make a sound, nor could she move. 8 legs, all long and hairy, gripped her in a strong embrace. She could only watch as the changed face of her little sister moved forward again to pierce her throat with its straw-like fangs. Spider bites. Isn't that a cute one? Okay, how many we got left? Yeah, we're not going to make it to the end. But we will get at least another story or two in, I think. Things from the Jungle. Ba-ba. Kind of makes me want to have a sibling. Oh, well. At last, Benjamin was finished sweeping. He scooped up the plant clippings, he spilled fertilizer and planting soil, and he deposited them in a big trash bag. Now all Benjamin had to do was to empty the wastebaskets. He took a second to look nervously around the nursery, especially into the mysterious green shadows behind him, then allowed himself a little break, leaning on his broom. His eyes wandered over the plants filling the nursery, and finally settled on the big sign bolted to the beam overhead, lit up in neon so that people could see it at night through the store's front window. "Things from the Jungle," the neon sign read, a pale green glow reflecting off the glass. The name had been his mother's idea. Everything had been his mother's idea. "Just think, Benjamin," she'd said only 2 years ago, "a nursery stocked with exotic plants shipped directly here from Africa. This town is filled with wealthy people who pay top dollar for something really unusual put in their yards." She'd been right, of course. Even though there were just 2 of them to run it, Things from the Jungle had been successful since the day it opened. Benjamin sighed. Then he looked behind him again into the huge warehouse where the plants were stored and cared for. It did look like a jungle, all right, with colorful flowers everywhere, vines looping from fluffy bushes and banana trees rising over it all. When his mother looked back there, all she saw was money. When Benjamin looked back at the vast leafy space, especially now at night, when the thick plants seemed to go on forever, he always had the same strange thought. Something's watching me. I know it is. Benjamin had that feeling now. He found himself staring into the green shadows, half expecting a pair of predatory eyes to glint back at him. He shook his head and put the broom and dustpan back in the closet. "Oh, grow up," he chided himself. "There's nothing back there but plants." But as usual, trying to be logical did no good. And Benjamin quickly finished emptying the waste baskets and headed out the front door. Relieved to be finished, Benjamin took a deep breath of the crisp air outside the warehouse. Then he took the trash sack to the open dumpster out back. But as he hefted the bag over the lip of the dumpster, he saw a strange shadow out of the corner of his eyes. A man was standing motionless just to the side of the dumpster. "Somebody's watching me, watching me." "Chester!" Benjamin yelled when he saw who it was. "You almost scared me to death." Chester shrugged, toyed the strand of his long white hair, then slowly walked way down the alley. As he watched the old man, Benjamin supposed every neighborhood had a homeless guy like Chester. He just wished that this one didn't have to spend so much time hanging around his nursery. Benjamin closed the dumpster's lid and walked the 50 feet between the family business and the family home, a small single-level house he and his mom had lived in ever since she opened Things from the Jungle. Inside there was evidence of his mother's green thumb. Every surface, from the television to the refrigerator, was covered with the potted plants she had personally grown from clippings in the nursery. The little plants, miniature versions of the huge untamed ones in the warehouse, made Benjamin's house look like a jungle too. Everything cleaned up out there, Benjamin? His mother called. Benjamin came into the den to join her. She was sitting at a craft table, her fingers working to pack little green vines into the soil of a ceramic pot. Yeah, Mom, it's all ready for the morning. His mother dribbled some water onto the newly potted plant from a watering can and set it aside. Finally, she pulled off a paper towel to wipe the planting soil from her fingers. Well, I'm going to turn in, she said, nodding at the wall clock. There's a truck coming in early tomorrow, and I have to open up the warehouse for the drivers to unload the new plants. After exchanging a goodnight kiss, they both retired to their bedrooms. But Benjamin had trouble falling asleep. He couldn't stop thinking of the big semi-trucks that brought new exotic plants and trees to the nursery once a month. He knew these trucks loaded up from the boats that came directly from Africa. But he'd always had a weird suspicion that the shipments sometimes contained, well, a little more than the plants he and his mom had ordered. After tossing and turning about for an hour, Benjamin lay at his side, staring off through his window at the nursery warehouse. Even from here, it felt as if something inside were watching him from behind the dark windows. Watching and waiting. When Benjamin got home from school the next afternoon, the entire nursery looked different. They had received an unusually large shipment with so many plants arriving on the truck that even the huge warehouse couldn't hold them all. The overflow spilled out into the small showroom near the front door and even into his mom's tiny office at the side. Everywhere he looked was a grass of green, curling green ferns, low flats of twisting green grasses, and green trees hanging with strange fruits. His mom's face peeked from between a pair of shaggy bushes. Hi, Ben, she said, with an exhausted but happy smile. Oh, boy, have we been busy. With all these new plants, I've been hooking up extensions to the drip lines all day. And look at all the customers. Benjamin nodded. There was quite a crowd of people wandering through the place now, admiring the new arrivals. Word always seemed to get out whenever things from the jungle received a new shipment. Give me a few minutes to put my school stuff away, Mom, and I'll be right out to help you. Thanks, honey. I knew I could count on you. When Benjamin came back out, Mrs. Gerard was the first customer to catch his eye. There you are, Ben, the plump old woman said. I've been waiting for you. She lived only 2 blocks away and had been one of their regular customers from the very beginning. About twice a month she walked to the nursery, purchased a plant or two, and sent her husband to pick them up by car later. Mrs. G, as she liked to be called, waved her hand about the room. I've never seen this place so full of greenery. Would you be a dear and show me some of the new things, Benjamin smiled and directed Mrs. G around, bending to check a price tag on a dwarf fruit tree or to explain how to care for a flowering vine. His mom had taught him quite a bit about plants, and he could identify almost every shrub in the place. Finally, Mrs. G stopped him. Oh, I love everything you've shown me, but I can't buy them all. Let me have a few minutes alone to think about it, will you, Ben? Benjamin nodded, watching as she strolled off into the warehouse, a wistful smile on her face. Then he went off to help a new customer. They finally closed at 6 o'clock. After the doors were shut up and the open sign was turned around, Benjamin's mom looked at him with raised eyebrows. I've got a good feeling about this, she said, turning with a dramatic flourish and pushing the button that opened the cash register drawer. She reached in and took a minute to count the cash inside. Oh, wow, we just had a record day, Ben. She took the money, slipped it into a folder, and then reached out to her to affectionately tousle Benjamin's hair. Thank you for all your help, honey. Tell you what if you do a real quick cleanup tonight, and I'll deposit the money in the bank, then I'll pick up a pizza on the way home. I think we deserve it, don't you? That'd be great, Mom. Make sure you get cashews on there, okay? While his mother was gone, Benjamin became lost in his work. As he swept up the fallen leaves, his mind mulled over the day's activity, and his stomach rumbled with the thought of a pizza dinner. But somewhere near the very rear of the warehouse, where the plants are so thick you couldn't see one sign of civilization, he stopped cold. High in the trees overhead, he heard a distinct rustling noise. It sounded as if some large animal was suddenly moving from branch to branch. Benjamin stared up in wonder, expecting to see what? Nothing except the usual canopy of jungle trees greeted his eyes. The noise stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. Benjamin looked around the huge plant-filled space. He was certain he was not alone, but no matter how long he paused, his heart booming in his chest, the noise did not repeat itself. The only things he could hear were the crickets sawing away in the darkness outside, the occasional light whooshing sounds of the timed drip lines going off at various parts of the warehouse to water all the plants. Finally, Benjamin gathered his courage and finished his sweeping. Then with shaking hands, he turned off the warehouse lights, locked up, and walked home. In the middle of their pizza dinner, the phone rang. Benjamin watched his mother's smile melt from her face. During the conversation, at the end of the conversation, she dropped the slice of pizza she'd been eating onto her plate. It was clear she had lost her appetite. "That was the police," she said, shaking her head in shock. "Mrs. Gerard's husband said she never made it home this evening. They wanted to see if we knew anything about her. I told them she'd been at the store, but I hadn't seen her since about 4 o'clock. Benjamin set down his pizza. He looked out the window toward the nursery, recalling the last sight he'd had of Mrs. G strolling deeper into the warehouse. He hesitated before he spoke. When he did, he was surprised at his own words. I wonder if the thing in the warehouse got her." Benjamin's mother stared at him in surprise. "What are you talking about?" Benjamin took a deep breath. "I mean, Mom, for the longest time I've had this feeling that something's been living in there. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't think you'd believe me, but tonight I heard this noise way up in the branches." His mom stared at him in horror. "I wonder if something could have hitched a ride from Africa, like an animal or a snake or something." Benjamin shrugged wide-eyed. "Maybe something attacked Mrs. Gerard, right in our nursery." She picked up the phone again and called the police, and Ben finished his pizza. 2 police cars pulled up a short while later and parked in front of the warehouse, emergency lights flashing. The officers told Ben and his mom to stay in the house. They sat silently in the living room, watching the red lights reflecting off the leaves of the potted plants surrounding them. Benjamin kept waiting for the sounds of gunfire or lion's roar, or even a cop yelling out, "There it is!" to the others. But nothing like that happened. Finally, they saw a tall policeman with a mustache making his way up to their house. They opened the door for him, and he nodded and handed Benjamin's mother his business card. "Well, we appreciate you calling us, ma'am. You can do it again if you think of something," he said politely, studying both Benjamin's and his mother's face with gray eyes. "But we searched every square foot in that building, and we couldn't find any signs of anything more dangerous than a couple of mosquitoes are living in there. We're sure there must be some other explanation for Miss Gerard's disappearance." Mother and son watched the police units pull away from the parking lot and drive off. Dazed, they wandered into the dining room. Benjamin looked sheepishly at his mother, who toyed with the cop's business card. "Must be my imagination, huh, Mom?" "Well, I hope so, honey, but it's good to be sure." She slipped the card under her telephone and snagged the white box on the table. With a deft motion of one hand, she flipped open its lid. "Anyone for cold pizza?" she asked with a smile. The next day was Saturday, and Things from the Jungle was having another record day. By noon, Benjamin had given brief tours to a school teacher, a hotel operator, several tourists, 2 gardeners, and one memorable family with 3 misbehaving red-headed kids. They had to put the closed sign up at 1 o'clock so Benjamin and his mother could take a few minutes out for lunch. They sat in her office while both munched on leftover pizza. Ben's mom had wanted to take their break in the nursery so she could go over the sales receipts while they ate. Benjamin sighed and listened idly to the ticking noise from her calculator. "Oh, thank goodness we're closed on Sundays," he thought. "We're going to need a day just to sit and..." Suddenly, Ben's thoughts were interrupted by a loud rustling noise swishing through the branches somewhere in the warehouse. It was a sound like Benjamin had heard the previous night. Something huge seemed to be leaping from tree to tree. He stopped chewing. His mother stopped typing. They both stared at each other, speechless, and wondered whether the officers were there if they had bothered to look up. The noise stopped. Mother and son walked carefully out of the office, looking about the nursery with bulging eyes. Everything seemed normal. "Did you hear it?" Benjamin whispered. "Yeah, honey, I did." Then turning to face the warehouse, she called out, "Is there anyone in there?" The only sound was the traffic rushing by outside. The end. No, that'd be a stupid place to end. Okay, so let's continue. That night, a knock fell on the nursery's front door just after closing time. It was the same mustached policeman who had visited them the previous evening. "Yeah, I'm terribly sorry to be bothering you again," he said as they opened the door. "We had a report that some other people have disappeared." "Other people? Disappeared?" Benjamin's mother asked, confused. "What's that have to do with us?" "Well, I stopped by because I noticed that their vehicle appears to be parked in your parking lot." He reached up and rubbed his neck. "I've got such a stiff neck. It's hard to look anywhere except straight forward and down." He pointed out the window at a dented minivan parked there. With all the traffic in and out of their little lot all day, neither of them had noticed it. Benjamin's mom clapped her hand over her mouth in surprise. Benjamin just stared, a strange idea coming into his focus in his mind. What do they look like? He asked quietly. The officer took a snapshot and held it up. Before them was a picture of a mother, a father, and 3 red-headed children. His mother was starting to shake her head to indicate that she hadn't seen them, but Benjamin nodded. Yeah, they were here. I showed them around, but they didn't buy anything. I thought they must have left. A sharp look came into the policeman's gray eyes. What time was this? Benjamin swallowed. About 11:30? Before lunch? Mind if I look around the warehouse again? Yes, please do, his mother said. Ben and his mother simply sat at the desk in the office, speechless. A mental film of the family replayed itself over and over again in Benjamin's head. A weird detail stuck in his mind. Everyone in the family had worn bright yellow tennis shoes. He went on to remember how all 3 red-headed kids kept taking off and running from their exasperated parents. Had one of the little ones led the rest of them deeper into the warehouse? To that spot where the wrestling noise kept coming from? Well,
weird detail stuck in his mind. Everyone in the family had worn bright yellow tennis shoes. He went on to remember how all 3 red-headed kids kept taking off and running from their exasperated parents. Had one of the little ones led the rest of them deeper into the warehouse? To that spot where the wrestling noise kept coming. Well,
Kayaker is magically repeating me.
Everyone in the family had worn bright yellow tennis shoes. He went on to remember how all 3 red-headed kids kept taking off and running from their exasperated parents.
I'll get that straightened out.
And one of the little ones led the rest of them deeper into the warehouse.
I hear you.
That spot where the wrestling noise kept coming. Well, Kayaker is magically...
Echo. Mr. Magic. There he goes. He fixed it. See, he's magic. One moment, please. I didn't see anything back there, the cop said, reappearing at the office door. But those plants you have are so thick, it's kind of hard to tell. He looked toward the 2 and offered them a tight-lipped smile. Look, it's possible their van wouldn't start if they came in here, so maybe they walked or got a ride. I'll have to get back to you, all right? You have my card. Please call my number if they turn up, all right? With that, he began walking toward the door. Alarmed, Benjamin's mom stood up. Is there anything else we can do? Well, yeah, the officer said, turning back toward them the final time. Why don't you guys keep your nursery closed until we figure out exactly what's going on in there? Benjamin's mother nodded grimly and watched the tall policeman let himself out. That night, Benjamin was restless again. For hours, he simply lay on one side, staring out his window at the warehouse, different explanations flitting through his mind. At midnight, Benjamin was still wide awake. He noticed a long shadow moving in the alleyway at the side of the nursery. He sat up straight in bed to see the soft outlines of potted plants his mother had placed along its sill. Something was creeping toward the window near the warehouse door, approaching from the direction of the parking lot. In the midnight gloom, Benjamin couldn't quite tell what it was, but whatever it was caused a chill to run through him. He got out of bed and pressed his nose to the glass. A man was fiddling with the window. In another second, he'd taken the entire window off. As he turned to lay it against the wall, a glint of moonlight stole through the clouds and lit up his face. Ben recognized the long white hair of Chester. Ben watched the old man climb through the window of the warehouse. Well, how long has Chester been knowing how to get in that way? Benjamin wondered. Is he looking for a place to sleep, or does he have other business in there? Benjamin quickly threw on some clothes. Chester must be behind all the disappearances, he thought excitedly. But I'd better be sure before I drag the police out here again. Benjamin walked quietly through the dark house, took the key ring off the hook under the kitchen counter, and then carefully slipped out into the moonlight. Walking slowly, careful not to make a sound, Benjamin approached the warehouse window. At last he reached the sill, and Chester had climbed it over to enter the warehouse. He hesitated, wondering if he dared to go in that way. Chester could be right there, just waiting for him. Benjamin decided the front door would be safer. Ever so slowly, Benjamin crept around to the front entrance and inserted the key in the keyhole, but when he turned the knob, it wouldn't give. Was someone holding the knob from the other side of the door? He tried again, and with a sigh of relief, he realized the key simply needed a little more pressure. In an instant, the door swung open. He was inside the dark showroom. Blinking, trying to adjust his eyes to the dimness, Benjamin could hardly see a thing through the thick masses of plants that absorbed any light coming in through the windows. He had to get to the office and turn on the lights. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin walked toward the office, using his memory of how the building was laid out to find his way. Plants seemed to reach out and touch him as he passed. At any second, he expected a hand to grab at him out of the blackness. Finally, though, he made it to the office. As he extended his hand toward the light switch, the familiar rustling noise swished through the warehouse, followed by a man's scream. Benjamin jumped and his fingers flipped on the switch. A single bank of lights flickered on, casting light on only one side of the warehouse. The scream echoed out again, becoming muffled at the end. Someone obviously needed help, and needed it now. Forgetting about the rest of the lights, Benjamin entered into the warehouse, squinting at the shadows. Something was moving wildly up ahead. Benjamin moved cautiously forward, looking up at a canopy of jungle trees. Then he saw something that made his heart stop. A vine was pulling Chester up to the treetops. Chester's feet and legs kicked and struggled in midair. The upper part of his body was entirely engulfed by the massive vine which wrapped around his torso. Benjamin, horrified, took a step back. Above him, hidden just under the huge leaves, were other human shapes. They hung motionless in the clutching vines, just like plucked chickens. From the bottom of one particularly small bundle dangled a small pair of bright yellow tennis shoes. Benjamin screamed. At the same time, the vines hauling up Chester paused, as if listening. A huge mass of vines, moving with incredible speed, suddenly dropped from the trees at the side of the warehouse. The action was accompanied by a loud rustling. They reached out and with the precision of a giant's fist, smashed into the bank of lights Benjamin had turned on. The fluorescent tubes cracked like matchsticks, and the nursery went dark again. Benjamin looked around, gasping in shock. He could not see a thing. Which way was it to the door? He hesitated, turning this way and that, his sense of direction gone. Above him, the rustling sound grew louder still. Probing tendrils tickled his face. Suddenly, a thicker vine moved up behind him and tried to loop itself around his throat. Tugging it away, Benjamin turned and plunged in the opposite direction. Toppling over small trees, tripping over bushes, Benjamin ran through the pitch blackness. Vines crawled out after him the entire way, snatching at his legs, grabbing his arms, yanking his hair. Finally, the darkness parted, and he saw the moon still riding high in the clouds through the window. He had made it to the front of the building. Safety was only a few feet away now. Still going full speed, Benjamin yanked at the doorknob and tumbled down the front steps in the parking lot. Panting and stunned, he lay there for a moment, thinking he had never seen anything as beautiful as the night sky overhead. But the clatter of breaking glass filled the night sound around him. He stared in disbelief as three monstrous vines shot through the shattered windows, coming after him, but only a few feet away they abruptly stopped. Benjamin slowly realized their roots anchored them from somewhere inside. Defeated, the pulsing stalk slithered snake-like back into the building. Benjamin picked himself up and ran toward the house. It wasn't wild animals. It wasn't other people. Rehearsing what he would tell the cop on the phone. Some weird kind of jungle plant was behind the disappearances. Benjamin let himself inside and hurried for the phone. He fished out the policeman's card and began dialing. But before he could reach the last number, something closed over one ankle. As he kicked, trying to free himself, another tiny vine wrenched the phone receiver out of his hand. Another one grabbed his other arm. He looked around the room in amazement. The vines came from pots all around. The pots his mother had planted with clippings from the nursery. He turned to call for her, only to see that her bedroom door was open. Her body was covered with green vines, streaming from pots all around her bed. Her body was not moving. Benjamin's other leg was entrapped by the vines now. A particularly big one was squeezing his chest. All of a sudden he could hardly move, but he found that he could scream. And Benjamin kept screaming, right until the moment the vines wrapped themselves firmly over his mouth. Things from the jungle. Feed me, Seymour. Wow, this is fun. We still have time for another one. Actually, I only have two more in the book. Man, maybe we can finish. Well, we'll get this one going anyway. This one, I hope you're enjoying. Thank you for sticking around so long. No one would fault you if you decide to leave, but thank you for being here. I hope you're enjoying our little halfway to Halloween celebration. Crash! The explosive sound of shattering glass snapped Samantha Collier's concentration away from the homework on her desk and toward her bedroom window. Somewhere she thought she heard a siren, too. There she saw her blue and white striped curtains billowing ghost-like as a steady breeze whipped through the jagged hole in what had moments before been a pane of double-glazed glass. Countless transparent shards lay in the carpet beneath the window, glistening like diamonds, and in the center of the debris sat the cause of this mess, a scuffed Little League regulation baseball. Great, Samantha moaned as she rose from her chair. Brushing aside her long blonde hair, she carefully picked up the ball, dusted off several tiny bits of glass, and looked out through what remained of her bedroom window. In the fenced-in yard next door stood 2 fifth-graders, Tommy Parker and Stort Boggs. Tommy, the skinny one, was wearing a baseball glove. Stort, who seemed to grow chubbier every day, was holding a bat. Both were wearing expressions of extreme embarrassment. Hi there, Samantha, Stort shouted up at the window, waving to her. Can we have our ball back? Tommy yelled. Samantha's reply was cut short by a flash of light, followed by a crash of thunder. Tommy and Stort immediately bolted for the house. A moment later, it began to pour down rain. This should hold you until we get the window replaced, son, Mr. Collier said as he tacked plywood board into position. I know it doesn't look very pretty, but at least it'll keep the rain and bugs up. Thanks, Dad, said Samantha. She was sitting cross-legged in her 4-poster bed, staring at the ugly plywood rectangle that now blocked her room's only source of natural light. She suddenly felt that her room had become a dungeon. The board had sealed her off from the outside world. How soon do you think I can get my window back? Well, I don't know. The repairman said he's pretty backed up right now. Said it'll probably be about a week, her dad said, yawning. Well, I hope Stort and Tommy are paying for this, Samantha said, her eyes now fixed to the wooden board. Was there baseball, you know? Oh, they're paying for it, all right, her dad said with a knowing smile. Their parents are making sure of that. Good, said Samantha. Her parents had raised her to own up to her mistakes. She hated to see other kids get away with not taking responsibility for their actions. Too bad they can't make the repairman come any faster. Yeah, I know. It's a real bummer, hon. Sorry. Her father agreed. He looked at his daughter. Dinner should be about ready. You coming down? Mom's barbecue and chicken. Yeah, in a few minutes. I've still got some homework to finish. Well, don't take too long, her dad said, heading for the door. You know how much work your mother puts into her Thursday night barbecues. Yes, Samantha knew all about her mother's barbecues. Although they could easily have afforded a propane grill, her mother always insisted on charcoal briquettes and mesquite wood chips. Sure, it takes longer, her mother always said, but it sure makes the meat taste a whole lot better. With the smell of the barbecue already wafting through the air, Samantha climbed off her bed and walked over to the plywood that covered her window. Something about that plywood had disturbed her the moment her father brought it into the room. It wasn't just its inherent ugliness for being plywood, and it was not the fact that it blocked her view of the world beyond. No, there was something else about this particular board. Something creepy that she couldn't quite put her finger on. And then she saw them. At first they looked like 2 ordinary knot holes. Well, they're not holes, what are they? You know, the kind of holes found in just about any wooden plank. But as she looked closer, she realized they weren't just knot holes. They were eyes. Stepping back, she saw that these eyes were framed by a series of lines and swirls that combined to form a nearly perfect face. A cat-like face. Above the eyes were a pair of angular whorls that became slanted eyebrows. Between the eyes was a ripple that doubled as a triangular nose. Below that was a twisted mouth and even a recognizable jawline. The arrangement of these features was too perfect to be just her imagination. It was as clear and distinct as the 4 faces on Mount Rushmore. Even more unsettling, the face seemed to be staring directly at Samantha. It seemed to know she was there, just as she could discern its presence within the wood. Dad! Samantha shouted, her voice cracking with fear. Dad, come here, right now! She immediately regretted summoning her dad. She knew exactly what he was going to say, for this wasn't the first time Samantha Collier had seen a face where a face didn't belong. For as long as she could remember, she'd seen faces, staring at her from the oddest of places, from the ceiling, from the wallpaper, from the clouds. To most people, these faces that Samantha saw were nothing more than random patterns of shapes and shades found in everyday objects. They were just dots in acoustical ceiling squares, flecks of black in a linoleum tile floor, or the natural lines and swirls found in a wooden desktop. But Samantha knew better. These faces were real. They represented life forms that other people, through blindness or simple refusal of belief, failed to see. When Samantha was a child, she would often cry in terror when one of these faces suddenly appeared to her out of a bathroom floor from within a billowing cloud. Now in middle school, she usually kept these sightings to herself. But this one was different. It was so obvious, so disturbing, she couldn't stay silent. "What is it, darling?" her father asked as he stepped back into the room. "What's wrong? Sam, what's wrong?" Look at this board," Samantha said, pointing at the image, her voice trembling. "Do you see it?" Do I see what?" her dad inquired, moving to his daughter's side. "The face," Samantha said. "There's a face in the wood." Her father examined the wood from one angle, then another. He shrugged his shoulders innocently. Sorry, honey, I just see a piece of wood. And you know why? Because that's all it is, Sam. A piece of wood. Your mind's playing tricks on you again." She knew her dad would say this. Her dad always said this. Why couldn't he see something so obvious? "But it's there," Samantha insisted, pointing to the board. "See? There are the eyes, the nose, the mouth." "I've told you before, hon, it's just an optical illusion. The human brain likes familiar patterns, and one of the first things we come to recognize as babies are faces. So when we see something that even remotely has a symmetrical design, we tend to put a human face on it. Some people see faces in ink blots or in parking meters. Some people have even seen a face on one of the mountains on Mars. Yeah, but that's real." Samantha closed her eyes and tried to push the horrible image out of her mind. She took a few deep breaths, then slowly opened her eyes again. The face was still there. It was looking at her, studying her, holding her in its sights. "You're right, Dad," she lied, afraid her dad would think she was crazy. "Yeah, it was just my imagination." Samantha stayed close to her father as they both went downstairs to the kitchen. She said nothing more about the face all during dinner and remained silent on the topic when they later watched a movie on cable TV starring Peter Parker. But that night, when she went to bed, Samantha knew she was being watched. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to get comfortable, but she was constantly aware of another presence in her bedroom. Finally, she turned over and looked up at the plywood board that covered her window. At first, the board appeared to her as nothing more than a large black rectangle. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, details became clearer. Just as before, she could make out the distinct shapes of eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Even more disturbing, these features seemed to be glowing from within. It was as if they were trying to burn their way out of the wood and into the world beyond, into Samantha's world. Her heart beating wildly, Samantha turned away and buried her face in her pillow. "It's just my imagination. It's just my imagination," she told herself. "There's no face in the wood. My mind is playing tricks on me." After a few minutes, Samantha was finally able to relax. But even as she drifted off to sleep, she remained convinced that here, in her bedroom, she was not alone. That's a thought we should all take with us for later tonight, don't you think? Anne Besh is what many people might call gothic. Anne preferred to dress mostly in black. Her hair, which was naturally medium brown, had been dyed the color of asphalt. When her mother allowed her to wear makeup, it was always very, very dark. Like so many of the kids who were into the Gothic movement, Anne Besh was very much into ghosts, ancient spells, graveyards, and anything else that suggested the supernatural. She and Rick would have gotten along very well, I think. Anne had long ago known about Samantha Collier's propensity for seeing faces where they shouldn't exist. Which is why, even though they came from very different backgrounds, Anne and Samantha had become best friends. "Spooky," Anne said after Samantha told her about the glowing face and the plywood board. "That is like so totally cool. I'm scared, Anne, Samantha confessed. It was lunch period. They were sitting off by themselves in a far corner of the cafe. I know I'm just seeing things, but I can't shake the feeling something is really there. Yeah, maybe it is, Anne said, raising a darkly shaded eyebrow. You've heard of the Druids, haven't you? I think so. Didn't they build like Stonehenge or something? Exactly, Anne said. They were the ancient inhabitants of England. They worshipped nature, the earth, the sky, the seasons. They believed that the life force was everywhere, even in rocks. And they believed that spirits, intelligent spirits, lived in trees. That's why we still say knock on wood, to ward off bad luck. So what are you saying? Samantha asked nervously. I'm saying that there really could be something in that board in your window. It could contain an ancient spirit, one that's fighting to get out. Well, do you think it's a good spirit or a bad spirit? Samantha asked. Well, now that's the final Jeopardy question, isn't it? Anne said slyly. What do you think? More importantly, Sam, what do you feel? Samantha didn't have to search her soul very deeply for an answer to that one. She knew exactly how she felt. She felt afraid. Very afraid. Who did this? Samantha demanded. Who did this to my room? She was standing in her bedroom doorway, surveying a scene that could only be described as total chaos. It looked like a tornado had swept through her room, dumping all her books and papers on the floor, ripping apart her neatly made bed, and knocking the pictures on her wall askew. The plywood that normally covered the hole in her window was now lying crookedly against the wall, allowing a strong, cool breeze to blow in through the shattered glass. Oh, my! Her mother gasped as she joined her daughter on the bedroom window. This must have happened while I was at the hospital doing my volunteer work. She walked over to the plywood board, picked it up, and placed it back over the shattered window. I guess the board must have come loose. The wind did this. We had a big wind blow through around noontime. No wind could have done this, Mom, Samantha insisted. Well, then what did? Her mother asked. You think a burglar broke in, messed up your room, then left without taking anything or touching anything else in the house? No, Samantha said, but left it at that. She was too scared to tell her mother what she really thought. Scared that her mother would think she was being a paranoid fool. Scared to admit the obvious even to herself. She spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess in her room, then collapsed exhausted in her bed around 9:30 that night. Almost immediately, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she instinctively felt another presence in the room. Then she heard breathing. Heavy breathing. There was no longer any doubt. Something was in the room. Alarm. Samantha bolted up in bed and looked around. She appeared to be alone. Then she looked over at the plywood board. The face was back, even more distinct than ever, and its eyes seemed to be twitching. It's just my imagination, Samantha said to herself in an almost ritual-like mantra. It's just my imagination. It's just my imagination. Slowly she rose off her bed, her right hand extended, and carefully approached the board. Foot by foot, inch by inch, she drew closer and closer to the strange glowing face that seemed to be staring back at her from within the swirls of the wood's grain. As her fingertips neared the strange glowing image, snap! Mouth literally jumped out of the wood, made a grab for her fingers. Samantha immediately yanked back her hand and gasped. As Samantha backed away, continuing to watch in horror, the creature within the wood slowly pulled its massive form out from the wood in which it had been imprisoned. First, the head came free, its skull the size of a lion's with huge forward-cutting jaw. Then its two front paws slammed down on the carpet, each foot armed with 5 thick, razor-like claws. Oddly, although the beast's form appeared alive and supple, it still retained the look and texture of wood. Samantha could see the lines of grain in its skin, along with a swirl of knotholes and the wave-like patterns of striations. She knew there was no time to call the police. There was not even time to get her parents. If this beast was going to be stopped, she'd have to do it herself, and do it now. But how? The answer came to her in a flash. As the monster continued to squeeze its way into her room, Samantha turned and, slamming the bedroom door behind her, bolted down the stairs to the first floor. She flung open the patio door and ran over to the backyard barbecue. She grabbed a can of lighter fluid in one hand and a butane-powered charcoal lighter in the other. Returning to her bedroom, she could hear something roaring and howling on the far side of the door, but there was no sound of movement. Perhaps the creature had not yet totally freed itself from the wooden prison. Screwing up her courage, Samantha turned the knob, then kicked open the door. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw, less than 10 feet away, the form of a huge cat-like beast, now almost fully formed. Not allowing herself to consider the danger before her, Samantha entered her bedroom and immediately let loose a stream of lighter fluid in the beast's direction. The animal snarled and spat as its face became drenched with a strong gasoline-like liquid, the substance soaking quickly into its pores. The can thunked hollowly in Samantha's hand as she realized it was now empty. She clicked the trigger on the butane-powered lighter. No flame. She clicked again. Nothing. Could it be out of fuel? Gripping the instrument with both shaking hands, she gave one last desperate pull. Click! She was rewarded with a glorious bright orange flame. Take this! She shouted and hurled the wand at the wooden beast. Whoosh! There was a huge explosive blast of air as the monster's body burst into flames. Samantha ran back into the hall, slamming the door behind her. There was an explosive bang as the creature hurled itself against the door, but the door held firm this time. Samantha, what's going on? Samantha turned to see her mom and dad standing in their bedroom doorway, looking dazed and confused. It's a fire, Samantha cried. We have to get out of the house, now! At the same moment, the beast howled and again threw itself against her closed bedroom door. To her parents, it must have sounded like a blast of wind bursting through her window to feed the raging inferno. But she knew the true source of the noise, and there wasn't much time left. Move! She cried, and grabbed her parents by the hand. Too confused to resist, they followed their daughter down the stairs and outside in the damp night air. Just before leaving the house, Samantha turned and saw what appeared to be a giant cat, its body in flames, bounding down the stairs after them. She immediately leaped onto the porch and slammed the door, trapping the burning beast inside the home. Oh, no, no, Samantha's mother cried. She was standing in the front walk, looking back at their house. Flames were pouring from Samantha's bedroom window. More flames appeared behind the living room window on the home's first floor as fire from the burning monster spread quickly to the carpet, the drapes, furniture. We're going to lose the house. Better the house than our lives, Samantha said, more to herself than anyone else, as a boom. The monster made one last effort to blast its way to freedom. Fairhaven Mental Hospital turned out to be far more pleasant than the stories that had floated around Samantha's hometown had led her to believe. The rooms were small, but sunny. The doctors and nurses were all extremely pleasant there in Fairhaven. The food, although not exactly delicious, was edible. Samantha continued to wonder if it was smart telling the police the truth about what had happened in her bedroom that awful night. She could have lied and said she just knocked over a candle, that the fire was an accident. But somehow Samantha felt the world needed to know that, contrary to what parents always tell their children, there are monsters in the world. Of course, the police did not believe her. And so here Samantha was spending day after day in her pajamas, attending countless therapy sessions as the doctors tried to cure her of an illness that she didn't even have. Yes, it was frustrating, but at least she was safe. Allowing her mind to wander, Samantha settled back under a pillow and stared up at the popcorn-style ceiling directly over her head. The room's low lighting caused the rough textured material to create a complex pattern of tiny shadows. Although these shadows at first looked like nothing in particular, as Samantha continued to stare at them, something more familiar began to take shape. Something unsettling, something frightening, something that would give Samantha Collier nightmares for the rest of her days. It was a face. So, happy halfway! The story was called Faces, if you didn't guess that. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Wow, on time. Look at that, right on the top of the hour. Woo! And this is from a 10-volume set called Scary Stories for Sleepovers. 99 stories. I think we have about 70 to go. So maybe we should do this again sometime. Thanks, everybody. Let's see, what do we got going on real quick? Friday, live DJ Rosa spends a 2-hour set of electronica, K-pop, J-pop at the Black Sun in Kitely. 3 p.m. in Kitely. Sunday, Blenders Buddies training classes. 7 p.m. Monday. Well, I'm not sure what we're doing 7 p.m. Monday. But we'll to be TBA. Let's see, leave it at that. But noon on Tuesday, Russell Up and Them live in the Glen at Shawnee Library. And noon to 2 p.m. Wednesday, Rock, Love, and Pop, DJ Angelic at the Caribou Adult Castle in Kitely. Would you catch all that? You probably did, but if not, you know where to go. Check the websites, www.shawneelibrary.com and storylinkradio.com. And don't forget, more ghost stories on the Halloween countdown. Thanks, everybody, and happy Easter. Didn't intend for the halfway to Halloween to fall so close to Easter. It just kind of worked out that way in my own little world. So I do hope you have a happy and blessed Easter. And take care, friends. Watch out for the spiders on the way out. And I don't think I have much in the way of prizes to offer in SL, but here in Kitely, if you decide you would like an NPC spider or an Animesh gator to take with you to share and enjoy at home, let me know and we'll hand one to you. I tried to make these wandering trees giveawayable, but there's something about them that doesn't let me do it. So sorry about that. Good night. Goodbye. Oh, yeah. And don't forget to tune into the YouTube channel. We already said that. Oh, good. Or if you missed any of the stories tonight, all 2 hours are on YouTube at... see if I can remember the... Gosh. There. Nope. There we go. And actually last week's, if you wanted to see those but missed any, they are not listed. But if you had the link from last week's advertisement, you can still catch them there for a bit longer. If you needed more stories. Goodbye. Good night. Hey, Fa, I didn't even say hi to you. See you in there. I love the outfit. You and Kira are perfectly attired for halfway to Halloween, which is on the same week as Easter. So y'all picked the perfect outfits. And good night, YouTube. 11. Wow, that's pretty good. Good night.